Welcome. It's hard to believe that it's actually the middle of October. You know, it's always like this here. It's like Palm Springs in Syracuse. Welcome tonight. It's very exciting to have Marion, Weiss and Manfredi here, especially with their beautiful project in the gallery. So I'm very pleased to host this, and I do want to thank Jean-Francois Bedard and the entire exhibitions committee for working to make the show look as wonderful as it does. So thank you. Each year through the Werner Seligman Lecture, we have the opportunity to see architects whose work relates to the rigorous vision of Werner Seligman, a teacher who helped to transform the School of Architecture at Syracuse University into a place of intellectual and creative energy in architectural pedagogy. We'd like to thank Jean Seligman for her continued involvement, and it's always great to see you. So. And beyond the obvious links, Michael Manfredi is a Cornell grad, and both Michael and Marion have taught extensively. Marion is a professor at Penn. The work of Weiss and Manfredi exemplifies innovation and a profound reading of history. Theirs is an inclusive view of architecture, one which reasserts the position of the architect in art and society at the scale of the building, landscape, furniture design, or pattern. The firm of Weiss Manfredi sees our territory expansively. Marion and Michael are founders of Weiss Manfredi, an interdisciplinary firm that's based in New York. And as long as I've known them and their professional work, since a competition, I think, in the late 80s for infill housing called Vacant Lots, which took place on a very dense site, their interest in the city and urban design has been clear, and it's probably at its most exuberant built form in the project we see in our gallery. Though not stylistically linked, earlier projects for the Brooklyn Heights Esplanade and Columbus Circle, or projects in Flushing Meadow, could be seen as prefiguring this interest. Their work considers the way we actually use things and the way they could work, the movement of people, the quality of light, the seasons, which should all seem second nature to us. But it's their very specific consideration that separates their work. For instance, the Memorial for Women in Military Service in Washington, D.C. stands as a kind of exemplar of an early exploration of movement, space, and light. Within an existing fragment of an apse, a classical apse by McKim, Mead, and White, they excavated a space, creating a new arc-shaped hall, a curved cryptoporticus, with an addition of glass panels echoing the classical apsidal form, but above ground, with incised quotations, which the sunlight projects as ephemeral text. The inscriptions, like the work of artist Jenny Holzer, recalls the traditions of writing in stone, but translated here into light. The work is both a memorial in the traditional sense, a marker, something set apart from daily life, but it's active and invites a changed relation to its subject, here the overlooked contribution of women in the military service. Seeing this building, this arc of lit glass, at the end of Washington, D.C.'s formal axes, at the entry to Arlington Cemetery, especially at night, is a powerful experience. And I think it's best at foot, on foot, where you can apprehend the change in focus and vantage point. Another early project, also the result of a competition, was Olympic Fields. And this was a park and a community arts center, which is remarkable for its subtle regrading and reuse of the land. And maybe this regrading was learned from the lawn at UVA. I'm not sure. but one's also struck there by the deep resonance with historical forms and patterns. A pre-existing building, which was a milking barn, was renovated with a very dry and crisp eye into an art center, and the landscape is terraced, linked with the site's agrarian past and the needs of its suburban Midwestern neighborhood. The tiered ground plane actually serves as a catchment area for floods. It's basically stormwater management and a park, both working within natural systems. I'm in the midst of a move now, and so all of my books are distributed in my house, mostly still in boxes. But I picked up a book which was an in-progress survey of Marion and Michael's work, published in the year 2000 by Princeton Architectural Press, called Site Specific. And even in this earlier publication, an orientation towards the land and a plasticity in the interplay of land and building was evident. The early sketches, for instance, of the Museum of the Earth shows a path made between two landforms, which now house exhibitions about history, this time geological. The stratification and unearthing suggested the cut in the earth, which sits in counterpoint with the green ridge above the Cayuga in Ithaca, where some of our friends are coming from tonight. In the years since these early projects, Weiss and Manfredi have become increasingly in demand for other academic and cultural clients, like Columbia University and Smith College, where again the attention to scale and placement on these very different campuses is handled with skill and beauty, with materials that bow to the site while marking the vividly new. Marion and Michael were awarded the Academy Award for Architecture by the American Academy of Arts and Letters of New York, as well as the Architectural League. Their work's been exhibited at MoMA in New York, at Harvard University, and the Design Center in Essen, Germany. They've won numerous competitions, both national and international, and have been featured in international publications and exhibitions, including those at MoMA, the Venice Architecture Biennale, the Sao Paulo Biennale of Architecture and Design, as well as the recent Design Culture Now at the Cooper Hewitt, their design triennial. And now we have before us this most recent grand work. It's truly an exceptional piece that commingles building and landforms. There's a much longer story of public will and partnerships with architects and enlightened clients, but this is their story to tell. I can only think what this project traces for future work. It's a great pleasure to welcome my friends and colleagues, Marion and Michael.
Well, first, Mark, thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. It's fair to say that we have a long-standing friendship with Mark. He failed to mention that he wrote an introduction essay in our book, Site Specific, which in many ways helped frame some of the trajectory of our future projects that weren't yet alive in that book. But mostly we're very, very pleased to be speaking here tonight among friends and colleagues that we admire. And we're especially honored to speak here as the Werner Seligman lecturers this year, because Michael and I both have a very special relationship with Werner Seligman. Everybody here, I think, knows his intelligence and his intensity, but we had a personal experience. He, I think, unraveled Michael at one of his more accomplished projects at Cornell and let him know what was not succeeding. And he nearly unraveled me, but did make sure that I won an SOM traveling fellowship after he let me know how much history I needed to learn on that trip. So it is a great honor to be here. And for us, I think Syracuse is coming alive right now as a school or as a kind of institution, as a place in the city, and as something that I think is looking at transcending all disciplinary boundaries. And for us, it's that transcending or cross-disciplinary that's been a preoccupation. The increasing transparency between design disciplines touches on a preoccupation that's become increasingly relevant to the work that we've been doing over the past several years, and which we'll share with you this evening. Design really is not an isolated discipline. While designers operate largely in the realm of the subjective, the personal, and the immeasurable, the integrity of our designs are inevitably enriched by both the realities and the measurable and the known. And the tension between the ideal and the circumstantial is precisely what launches discoveries that you might not anticipate at the outset. This is especially true for architectural work that operates outside the archetypal norm of the architectural object on the open and unobstructed site. Think Villa Savoy. And the sites and programs that Michael and I have found most interesting and that launched our sort of conversations together that led to our practice had to do with sites and programs that have been found at somehow the periphery of disciplinary boundaries, and they avoid neat definitions. And in that regard, they suggest that perhaps it's a peripheral vision between these disciplines that is really the kind of core of our own preoccupation and our mode of operation.
I feel a little like a televangelist here, but we are among friends, so I won't preaching to the choir, perhaps. To pick up where Marion left off, our practice then is biased toward a direct cut and section across disciplines where a more synthetic and opportunistic approach to the interstices between disciplines is essential. The disruption of disciplinary distinctions has caused each discipline to expand: engineering, landscape, architecture, product design, art, to expand and redefine itself in new terms and in relation to new areas of expertise. But, as Hal Foster has stated so eloquently, before there can be an interdisciplinary approach, there must be a disciplinary expertise. This is crucial in the context of our education. Education as architects, designers, landscape architects, and it's certainly part of the nexus of theory and practice that we think was so fantastic and such a legacy of Werner Seligman's work. We don't believe in the standard paradigms. Neither the ideal of the untouched site nor its opposite, the privileged natural or historic site, are any longer legitimate for contemporary work. Rather, working from a definition of site that incorporates infrastructure, rail lines, highway off-ramps, even utility lines, history, geologic history, political history, cultural history, and natural systems, and by that we would include water, vegetation, even toxicity, we avoid the pretense of imagining architecture only on a neutral site, a tabula rasa, or the confused and equally reductive agenda of landscape imitating natural forms. It's this hint at an unlimited lateral terrain that informs the projects that we'll discuss this evening. Perhaps we can start with the first image. And these are a series of images that actually have been sort of haunting us for a number of years, and they might be familiar to some of you. And we return to them occasionally as sort of touchstones. They touch on the issue of perhaps of site and entropy. This particular image represents a long, almost half-mile long inscription in Peru. It's believed to represent a kind of astronomical clock. It's quite ancient. It's a sort of piece of infrastructure. We love to sort of think of that in the context of Robert Smithson's spiral jetty, where the idea of entropy is played out, measure in terms of the ground plane, but it's also a kind of clock too, not unlike the Peruvian antecedent. We think of culture, the root of cultivation. Those two words are wonderfully paired together. This is one of many, many examples. Again, also perhaps a piece of infrastructure. In a way, not too dissimilar from the Spanish Steps, a way of thinking about a kind of a meshing of both the poetic and extremely practical. You could read this as Pope Sixtus's great attempt to turn Rome into a kind of 16th century theme park, a way of connecting point A and point B. More recently, these two images are both sort of haunting, frightening, and intriguing as well. The image on the left is the entry to the GW, entry to New York across the GW Bridge. The image on the right is Roe Etheridge's rather beautiful photograph of Atlantic Junction. Again, both beautiful and frightening, but for us, offer extraordinary opportunities. And by us, I mean all of us in this room, designers. But likewise, as Mark touched on, I think we fundamentally make things, so we're interested in the kind of tactility. We love to imagine this piece by Dan Flavin, where light, which is ephemeral, is made to look hard, impenetrable, thick, viscous. And pair that with this fantastic piece by Bernini, the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, where stone, typically a hard material, is rendered soft, pliable, almost luminous.
Now, Mark referred to what really launched our practice. And part of this came from conversations that Michael and I had shared about wanting to take on projects that didn't fall so neatly in one category or another. And competitions are remarkable because they typically ask questions that don't have predetermined outcomes and certainly don't have an idea about who can or should compete. The Women's Memorial Competition, which we won in 1989, was our first project, and we were fortunate enough to have a client who said, if you don't have a practice, you better start one today, and we did. But the amazing thing here was, it was a question of how do you honor the women who'd served in the military since the Revolutionary War, who had gone unacknowledged, and how could you do that here in this incredible setting at Arlington National Cemetery, which was in fact the McKim-Meaden-White hemicycle, which was the terminus of the long axis that linked the Lincoln Memorial to Arlington National Cemetery. In fact, that had been a competition, and the hemicycle itself was really just a 24-foot retaining wall. And in fact, they didn't know what it would be. And on the walls were inscriptions that said, in the working drawings, justice, wisdom, etc., inscriptions not in contract. No knowledge of what this should be. It was indeed a barrier that held the earth back, and we saw this then as a parallel barrier of women passing through this wall and reaching and ascending to a place where their stories could be told. So what you see here was the idea of breaking those barriers, of cutting through and carving through that wall with 4 stairs, and then an arc of glass tablets that would be like a journal with the binding broken and the pages fanning across the upper length of the cemetery, with these inscriptions of and about not one heroine, but in fact the stories of and about the women who had served. Building was an incredible experience to learn about. We were literally up against grave sites and a hard wall. And the 15-foot setback requirement actually ended up requiring setback from reserve grades as well. The wall had to come in 15 feet during design development. But what in fact was compelling is that in this amazing landscape of the cemetery, there was a place of incredible quiet within the monumental core of Washington. And this became a kind of 250-foot arc of glass tablets bearing inscriptions of and about the women who had served, and the intent was that these would be legible both from above but also within the gallery, with these inscriptions casting shadows that would have ephemeral legibility inside the memorial gallery, or very precise depending on the angle of the sun. The existing counterforts themselves framed at the exhibition, and the screen of the marble on the other side catched the story. But what you could see was behind the gallery wall was a series of events, if you will, the education center's amphitheater space, the Hall of Honor, and in fact a computer register here that would have continued to have all the stories of the 2 million women who served. But for us, I think it really was this incredible slice within the landscape where this illumination could be barely there on one hand and join the incredibly powerful monumental axis of Washington. Now, orphan sites have been another preoccupation of ours, and the New American Green competition, which was an international competition, sounded so amazing in its international premise, but in fact was on a 20-acre site that was barely surviving out in the middle, just south of Chicago by about an hour. 20 acres, farm buildings, and in fact a thought that this might in fact be torn down. Now, we started to think about how could this become an acropolis? How could the old barn be transformed into something now as this community art center that Mark described? And it was really the premise of how do you take an entirely flat site and give it a there in a suburban area that had no center. And what you can start to see here was a choreography of excavating the core of this not only for playing field sizes, but more importantly, the only way to keep it from being value engineered and eliminated was to demonstrate that it could handle all the water detention and retention areas that were essential in this area. This was a time of the great floods, and in fact, these were key requirements. So you can start to see how it handles the 5, 50, 100, and 500-year storm. At the perimeter, 750 trees have now come to 1,200. But in fact, it was opening up this barn so that it could become a kind of transparent window onto the landscape used during the summer and be thermally sealed during the wintertime. And taking the notion of the lightest touch possible, the inside of the barn is mortise and tendon. We just painted it white, put in a concrete floor, and let it be, in a sense, as raw space as it could be. In fact, the way to preserve this rawness was to clad and insulate from the outside rather than the inside. But it really was trying to reclaim this agricultural heritage. We did think of planting corn on the side. We heard that was impractical, and so this is a band stretch of phlox and gaillardia, phlox and gaillardia, and phlox and gaillardia to get the striping that we were keen on. What you see are pavilions there for the playing fields on the left, but more importantly, the water detention actually back cuts with a pipe underneath that exits out here, and in fact the retention area here is a fluctuating one. The working windmill keeps the water recirculated. Now, a lot of the preoccupations that we've had about marking the earth, engaging it, leveraging the inherent and intrinsic potentials of a site came into focus in this project that's very near here. And so all of you, I'm sure, know the kind of glaciation and the Finger Lakes region and how the retreat of the glaciers created this strange set of cuts and identity of this particular landscape. The Museum of the Earth in Ithaca actually takes place on a site that you would never guess had the kind of underpinnings of this glacial cut. But in fact, what inspired us is something that it turns out also inspired Frank Lloyd Wright. This is one of the gorges in Ithaca. Frank Lloyd Wright, apparently after getting an incredible tour of all the buildings at Cornell, finally came to the gorge and he said, "This is what impresses me."
Turns out Frank Lloyd Wright never designed a building at Cornell after that, so we are told. But I think many of you know the incredible geometry, and in this little sketch, the red dot represents the site for the museum itself, but these little kind of white squiggles represent our attempt to kind of map the sort of pattern of fissures where water emerges and moves across the site into Lake Cayuga. It's an extraordinary geometry that's visible. So here you see the idea of taking the program and splitting it into two volumes that frame a space. And the sort of diagonal that moves across the site was a way of, in a way, capturing water that daylit on that site. So in a way, sort of taking something rather than concealing it and channeling it and getting it out, which is the typical civil engineering approach, we were interested in making this a sort of element that actually organized the site. So that little cut tends to run perpendicular to Lake Cayuga and parallel to a series of other cuts that in some cases form extraordinarily dramatic gorges. But you can see the sort of, in this maquette, the museum itself is comprised of two buildings. And then, since parking became a very important issue, we have attempted to organize the parking into a series of trays that accommodate and, in a way, give measure to a site that appeared flat, but actually has a very steep grade. And like the exploration that Marion touched on, the park, this became an opportunity not as much to collect water, but to channel it, so that the parking lots are back-pitched, and depending on the amount of rainfall, snowfall, they then track into the sort of long cascading series of kind of sort of triangulated series of water terraces, and then finally emerge, and you can see it on the far right, into a water detention area at the base of the project. So the sort of narrative of water is both, I suppose, metaphorical as well as literal. The plan is such that it's a kind of Guggenheim in reverse. The first image on the left is the roof plan, and the second image is the ground floor plan, the sort of plaza level. we tried to really play up the kind of idea of section so that you come in on a sort of upper level, descend down, unlike the Guggenheim where you go up, you descend down into a series of exhibition areas which are actually housed in a large volume here. We actually, the exhibitions were designed by an exhibition designer named Kennedy, so we won't get into the exhibition design in great detail. Marion and I try to draw. We're extremely Catholic in the kinds of tools we use. You'll see computer simulations like the rather elaborate version of the Olympic Sculpture Park out. We use lots of models, and I think as architects, and I think it was evident upstairs, is that we're interested in grabbing as many tools and working with as many tools as we can simultaneously. So you can see these early attempts to think of this museum less as a series of buildings, but more as a kind of sectional journey. We had the opportunity actually to work with a landscape architect and paleobotanist named Amy Nettleton was a landscape architect, and Dr. Crepé was a paleobotanist, but also an incredibly inventive civil engineer. And I think in many ways it was a great lesson in grading and the capacity to think of grading as a sort of spatial condition, as a sort of material quality as well. And that gave us a chance to extend the confines of a relatively small museum out into the landscape. So you can start to see the sort of transition from the cut in the earth at the parking lots at the top, moving down to the space between the two buildings, which gets rather compressed, and then finally to a permanent water detention area. This is the view from one of the upper parking lots. You can see the parking lots on the right. It actually turns out that there's very little water, but what's quite beautiful is we fortunately were able to work with a stone that is called Lenrock, which is the reverse of Cornell spelled backwards. But it's an incredibly beautiful stone and full of fossils. And this was also an opportunity to think about how the ground plane might be constructed and the capacity to treat the ground plane as a sort of a plastic, not in a material quality, but a sort of spatial quality, that sort of plastic surface that might also have a pedagogic role. If you go up close to this, you can also see a number of fossils. So it has this sort of narrative that starts appropriately enough for the Museum of the Earth as you emerge from your car. And you get a little sense from of the scale of these enormous boulders. We often are dealing with light materials, but there was something liberating about mass. So the journey starts at this plaza. You can start to see the kind of sectional relationship of the buildings, partially submerged, then reappear on the downhill side. And we enter at grade with a contemporary mammal. This is a right whale. And then descend all the way down to a rock, a Devonian rock. And you can start to see in the fossils in the Devonian rock certain skeletal antecedents to the skeleton of the right whale. So there's a sort of story that goes, a pedagogic role that somehow we hope is linked to an architectural experience. The edge of glass marks the ground plane, so you've got some way of understanding if you're above grade or below grade. Finally, the sort of space between where you can start to see water being collected. There's actually a little garden there now. Water's collected in this plaza area. Slides through here. Down in the lower right, there's a kind of opening, a channel, and then it descends into a very different kind of receptacle. We're amazed at nature's incredible resilience. There's probably 20, 30 different kinds of frogs that have already turned this into an ecosystem where insects of all sorts, birds, it's just amazing. A period of, I think this project was done maybe 4 years ago. Now we'll start with a different project, and we intentionally, I should say, have arranged these projects in a non-chronological order. For us, design is iterative. You might see certain themes. I think we'll let you make the kinds of connections. But you don't design by going from point A to point B to point C. I think you're always re-examining the territory you've just discovered and then rethinking it. And so too, I think, in how we work and how other architects we admire work. This is a visitor center for the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. The site's incredible. It sort of sits at the edge of this parking lot where that little kind of pavilion is. It's a sort of Janus-like site. On one hand, there's the parking lot, but once you emerge through the sort of parking lot, through that narrow little plaza, you discover this incredible oasis. And a botanic garden is a museum of sorts, a living museum. But you can start to see dotted in this sort of blue dashed line our site, and it very much transitions between existing parking lot, existing gate, and Washington Avenue, and this fantastic set of gardens. We're very intrigued with the idea of a kind of inhabitable topography. So it's less about building, but more about extending an incredible berm and a set of sort of brilliantly juxtaposed gardens. This is a Japanese garden and then a formal cherry allée. So you can start to see how the visitor center has been shaped less as a kind of building, but more a kind of built path, which you'll start to see with a kind of diagram. And a sort of knot, because the path can be approached from an upper level as well as a lower level. But here we start to give that path sort of measure. This is very much a work in progress. I think we feel like students presenting to a large jury here, so you'll have to be a little patient. But again, I think multiple ways of looking at a project, sort of giving it measure, testing it. And you can start to see the sort of program pieces. If we start, maybe I'll just use this pointer, in the upper right, this is the entry plaza that you saw where that pavilion was. There's a gift store. They have a number of fantastic programs, so in many ways this is an educational component as well. You enter through a kind of long gallery, an exhibition gallery. There's sort of an orientation room, offices, bathrooms, all that stuff, cafe, and then finally an event space for all sorts of events. And likewise, that secondary path comes in, slips through, turns around the event space, and then descends and makes a kind of knot. So the two conditions of the garden, entry plaza on the left, and then the sort of upper path, sort of present or define two very, very different ways of reading this building. Like with the Museum of the Earth, I think we're trying to play up the blurring between what's a sort of existing earth form, shaped earth form, and building, and you see that in these sequential sections. But if the garden side is sort of extraordinarily open and legible from this particular vantage point, the thought is that the interior gallery is no more than a kind of lens to look out into the garden.
Now, I guess this is going from the bucolic to, how shall I say, the infrastructurally challenged. Many of you know that New York was the American U.S. finalist for the NYC 2012 Olympic bid. And we were asked to do the whitewater rowing venue and the flatwater rowing venue in Flushing Corona Park. Now, if you start to think about Flushing Meadows Corona Park, you may know of it as the place of the 29 and the 64 World's Fair. You may know of it as Shea Stadium. You may know it as the tennis center. But I'm not sure if this is the pointer right here, but this is the Long Island Expressway, and then the Van Wyck and the Grand Central flank it on either side. So the historic core of the World's Fairs, both of them existed here. You can see the kind of Beaux-Arts plan. And then you could see that it kind of, these two water reservoirs here, divided by a mass of land and some bridges, became somewhat left over. Now, this became an incredibly interesting question, which is, among other things, these venues needed to have a legacy after the Olympics. And for us, what became curious is that this long history revealed that, in fact, Flushing truly had a reason for its name. It was indeed a full body of water that was all daylit. And then it became buried over in what, in The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald referred to as the ash heap of the country, and indeed it was. But as we started to look at these, the World's Fairs, and then started to look at this site, it had so many components, but the undeniably most powerful one was that you could never get there. You could only get past it because of this infrastructural Gordian knot. So working with L'Oreal, and who was the landscape architect who coordinated with all the architects who did the venues of all the Olympic proposals, we started to think of not only where the flat water venue would be, right here, but the whitewater, by reclaiming certain parts of the World's Fair landscape and reconfiguring, if you will, not only that the flat water and the whitewater, which I'll talk about in a moment, but trying to consider a new connection that could have a stealth-like relationship to the Long Island Expressway. And so here you can see the reflecting pool that's right on axis, if you will, with the unisphere. But while it looks, how shall we say, dead in the water, it's the most alive place in the world on weekends. There's 88 languages spoken in Queens, and they all come together in the soccer matches that line around this pool. And so actually what was most important for the community was that we preserve those soccer fields. So we came up with a kind of a hybrid idea, which is that to achieve the 18-meter grade drop that's necessary for a whitewater event, we needed to elevate the grade. The site was completely flat. But simultaneously, it gave us an opportunity to create an amphitheater for 30,000 spectators, but also created amphitheaters for the soccer fields that would then have, in effect, a sense of stadium-type spectacularness as opposed to the flat leftover space. One of the things that we've learned is that based on what they did in Australia, they can simply use pins going through rocks to generate the turbulence that makes it, in fact, an Olympic event. Now, the question, though, of the space between, from whitewater to flat water, in fact, the landscape is an incredibly desolate one, full of maintenance roads and the on and off ramps that fly over the site. For us, though, we actually loved this and thought that if we could actually work with the ecologist who we did, Paul Mankiewicz, to resurface the water that had been carried below the earth, that we could actually recreate a wetlands that it used to have, and let this be the most amazing aqueous Pyrenean landscape of wood boardwalks that would swing under these on and off ramps and connect these two separated sites. And working with light artists, actually show that the structure, which is so extraordinary. And in fact, this Pyrenean connection is most extraordinary. The Van Wyck is coming on and off, and we absolutely got excited about this landscape now becoming part of the public realm. And then you can start to see that that route, which we were just looking at, slips underneath all those on and off ramps and continues here. And what we did was we took those two reflecting pools, or those two reservoirs, connected them with a bridge, created a peninsula here for the boathouses with the practice rowing lane here and the full Olympic length flat water there to the right. But because 6 boathouses were utterly tiny, it was actually the creation of the peninsula that it was the creation of the peninsula that allowed us to create this, this amphitheater for people observing the races, but a way of concealing the garage, if you will, of these boathouses. So that this particular landscape, which we think is fantastic, you can see the Unisphere and the Johnson Pavilion here, that somehow those would all be brought into focus now with this new lateral alley of boathouses along this peninsula, and connect for the spectacle then past the 2012 Olympics. Now, we were wistful yet hopeful when John Doctorow said this is just about his favorite project of the 2012s, and that maybe somehow this could happen, so we're still keeping our fingers crossed. But if we think about this idea of movement and connection, I think that this is now, Michael will begin this thing, this is Smith College Campus Center as it was.
And if the idea of movement, I think, very much in a lateral way, the thinking here was to try to develop movement in a sectional way, not unlike the Museum of the Earth. But this is we were asked to design a campus center for Smith College in this area here, somehow between a series of rather beautiful turn of the century, actually earlier, 1850s, large wood houses as compared with the much more gravity-bound brick buildings that were less residential but more academic. But the site had been a kind of parking lot, and what was fascinating is when we visited it in the winter, you could see the kind of markings across the site where students and faculty would sort of shortcut. A lot of residential activity here, a lot of the residence halls on this side of the site. So students would really, like anyone intelligent, would sort of pick the kind of fastest way to get across, and then would continue along one of the major routes that connected the sort of parts of Smith College. Now, Smith College is an extraordinary setting, less architecturally, but more because the topography undulates. It was actually designed by the Olmsted brothers and has a sort of beautiful quality that's hard to kind of quite identify. But the idea of circulation as a kind of generator is evident in this kind of rather crude little study model that we were playing with, and the thought that we ought to postpone, somehow hold off on defining a building, but think more about how circulation might define a trajectory or a design, hopefully is evident in this little study. Well, we show this because we make lots of mistakes. There are probably 40 mistakes on this little panel and another 40 back in our office. And I think actually Le Corbusier, no slouch, said creation was a patient search. I think we're still trying to figure out how patient we have to be. But in a way, the idea of the building or the sort of program pieces defining this route is sort of tested, given measure, in both the sketch, the charcoal sketch, and then this slightly more sort of precise way in which both structure and program might be collapsed. It actually turned out, when we went through the sort of structural logic of this, that a warped frame, a kind of skeletal structure, was much more efficient than the sort of linear, kind of Tirani-esque idea of a planar structural system. But this is where the kind of program pieces start to fall into place. The route that connects Elm Street, a kind of small, historic New England street, with the large, expansive Chapin lawn, which we worked very hard to kind of reconfigure and make even more expansive. This sort of internal street provides the kind of glue for a series of program pieces that we'll touch on that include everything from study areas to cafes to exhibition spaces. But if the campus side is expansive, the building kind of peels apart, reveals itself in a sort of broad way. The Elm Street side is small. It's more reticent. It's more finely grained, as a way of acknowledging the kind of urban texture that is characteristic of this kind of street. The thought is that this ought to be Main Street. This is the place where everybody comes, talks, looks at each other, gossips. And in order to kind of give that measure, we've sort of taken a kind of way of diagramming the three sort of spatial tropes, I suppose, or spatial systems. One is the cover, which is this kind of warped, twisting skylight, the kind of, it's actually warped in section and in plan. That sort of center space is defined by what we call a series of liners, simple wood panels that establish a kind of meter. And then finally the building is clad in a system of wood panels that Marion will touch on as we proceed. But here you can start to see the kind of sectional quality. It's a three-story building masquerading as a two-story building. We actually carved into the kind of the terrain, have one level below grade and two above, and tried to slip the roots so that, like a kind of knot or a rope, they are evident. And that route is sort of marked by a kind of extended cafe. The tables are made out of a sort of poured resin, which play with the idea of kind of landscape.
Now, this play with landscape was a preoccupation for us. As some of you may know, in spite of today's weather, that when you're in a campus setting in the Northeast, winter begins usually October 1st and wraps up right around commencement. And so we wanted this to have an interior landscape that would be light-filled no matter what the time of year was. And so from the photographs of Smith's Botanic Gardens, which they have an extraordinary collection, all the trees, by the way, it's an arboretum as well, all the trees are named and tagged, we actually took these photos and blew them up and embedded them in the resin so that they could be simultaneously transparent, so that the skylight could bring light all the way through the building, through these tables, onto the concrete floor. And they effectively carry this garden path, if you will, all the way through the building from Elm Street to the main campus area, and create a kind of luminous setting then when you're up on the upper levels. But the idea really of a campus center is to see and be seen, and it was our keen argument that after we got the libretto on net to gross and efficiencies, that we said, if this is an efficient building, nobody will come. And in fact, it's the most inefficient buildings that are probably the places we want to be. It was also about lateral vision, peripheral vision, so that we could see down into a garden lounge or across into one of the private study lounges. And so, as Michael said, this was a 3-story building disguised as a 2-story building, but we wanted that lower level, which actually encompasses almost 40% of the square footage, to actually feel just as light-filled as the other levels. And so we carved away the landscape on the left side so that if you look at this glass, you're going to see something in a moment that, imagine that the earth used to be up to here, that brings light both from above and below. And this is the level where, in fact, there's the mailboxes, and a staircase here is generous enough to serve as an amphitheater when there are impromptu performances here. But if that's all about openness, the kind of main lounge with the fireplace was a vision of both President Ruth Simmons, who's now at Brown, and Maureen Mahoney, which is how could a main lounge, which we had turned to overlook Paradise Pond, their main landmark, be a place that was always and permanently a warm and inviting place, because again, at times, Smith is not exactly as balmy as it is right here today in Syracuse. But there it is. You can start to see the carving away of the landscape was no small feat, because we wanted to do a 1 and 2 slope, which is impossible to grow anything on unless it's infrastructurally stabilized. And so what you could see is that you could imagine this was clearly out of budget to plant this, and so there were over, I think, 78 volunteers over the course of the weekend from their kind of arboretum collectors planting liriophy plugs, sort of like hair plugs for men or something. But it's actually a brilliant system of performing erosion control. But in many ways, this building is this kind of chameleon. Michael showed the one side that was very modest on Elm Street. It took us 18 months to get an approval from the Massachusetts State Historic District to look properly modest on that side. But on the campus side, we were able to open up and become a more generous and inviting beacon. The residential buildings on campus are wood. The academic buildings were brick. We chose wood to kind of collaborate with the more relaxed fit as opposed to the gravity-bound academic buildings. But that paneling, because it is a large building, had to take on a rhythm, a tactile collaboration with the wood structures around. And so we have 13 different panelized systems with basically couldn't it be more straightforward, rough fir with a metered batten system that conceals the joints but also creates a kind of a chromatic set of shadows that play depending on the angle of the sun. And that, you can see now at night, opens up and unfurls so that this is a kind of landmark of beacon on the campus. And that interior walk actually carves, spills, crosses a path, and becomes an amphitheater out to Chapin Lawn. But it's also, I think in our mind, a kind of wonderful collaborator with the snow, which covers the ground for much of the academic year. And in many ways, they liked the white because it responded to the 5 white church structures that were on Elm Street. Now, Mark mentioned our earliest collaboration, and I'm too embarrassed to say how long ago it was, but let's just say nearly 2 decades ago, Michael and I worked on a couple of pro bono projects in Harlem. And that was what excited us, which was the possibility of bringing architecture to places that never saw architecture. And so when we were invited by the Robin Hood Foundation to be one of the 10 architects who could draw straws to go to the neediest schools and design a library for free, that would be paid for and built by the School Construction Authority with all the books donated by Scholastic, the computers by Apple, so on and so forth, we immediately said yes. We were so excited to be considered. We drew the longest straw as an hour and 20 minutes to get out to Far Rockaway, Queens, to get to PS 42. And we were brought up by the principal to the 4th floor of a walk-up building, and she showed us the space that was going to be turned into the library. As we were walking downstairs, we were somewhat wistful, and we realized with this walk-up, nobody would go there, and we asked her if we could take over one of the gyms. There was a boys' gym and a girls' gym. She said, let me talk to my faculty. She called the next day and said, you can use the gym. So here's the gym. And that made it possible to think about the kind of dynamics, the movement, kids arriving, they're K through 4, they're a wild lot. And that why not? Why couldn't a library be just as animated and as engaging as that energy? And so what we started to do was we looked at the columns and we imagined if you could think of an occupiable bookworm, if you will, what would make books the sexiest thing that you could possibly think of? And then what would make that occupiable bookworm the most provocative thing from the other gyms and from the cafeteria? It would be those cutouts that you see in a construction fence that make you want to look in to wonder what the heck is going on. And so that was really our premise, as simple as that, an occupiable bookworm. This is now that space transformed. But what was intriguing, though, was that we had almost no money. I wouldn't say we had quite the limited budget that you see here in this building. We'd love to boast that it was $65 a square foot, but it was a little more than that. But you can see the same raw hand, in fact, the same light fixtures you see coming down on stems you've got in your own building. But it had to be, in our mind, completely transfigurable. So spaces that might be quiet and intimate needed to immediately become large and public. Bookshelves that were deployed during the day had to be retracted to open it up for meetings. So what you can start to see here is that those kind of construction fence windows are right here. There's actually reading lights above so that you could inhabit that wall. But we came up with a runway idea along this edge and then the kind of soft acoustic carpet there, and then decided to keep this thing truly in motion, that we would design these rolling beanbag chairs that the students could then wheel around the classroom. Now, they were wildly successful, and they actually required that we add on brakes, and that came in a little bit later. Now, the real question, though, was how could we, in fact, have a kind of private reading area? You saw back here that that was retracted right there. But we wanted to be able to create the notion of a place to read. And so working with Pentagram graphic designers, we came up with a kind of word list, like a crossword puzzle that could be read on a theater scrim. Michael and I originally thought that we wanted a velvet curtain just to offer this great sense of privacy. The library said, "Are you kidding?" You have to know there is an armed guard outside the front of this building. Now, you could start to see these bookshelves then deployed and compacted on this channel here so that the space could be used for a bunch of different things. But I think our favorite experience is knowing that teachers come down here and teach to smaller groups, particularly after school, within this kind of reading area. And you can see the graphics that Pentagram did making their way out so that this alarm of what this is present across the whole perimeter. But inside, it's ideally a fantasy world that the students can invent for themselves.
Well, a very different kind of academic setting. This is another project that's very much a kind of work in progress. It's a art center for Barnard College called the Nexus. And this is the kind of Barnard College, a sort of classic college, urban college, built in a way to sort of hold the city out, and it's kind of characterized by this beautiful wrought iron system of gates, and presumably at 6 o'clock the gates would be locked and there'd be no hanky-panky going on. Everybody would be happy. But what's amazing about this campus is right across the street from New York, from Columbia, sort of heart of New York, on Broadway. And the kind of ground plane in New York, any little bit of grass is precious. And we were taken with these two images. One is Lehman Lawn, where students are just extraordinarily inventive about using it as a space. And then the sort of more formal companion, the courtyard at Millbank. And these two are disconnected. I'll explain in a few minutes. But the other thing that's characteristic about this site, as is the case in many projects in New York, is that the ground plane is sort of relative. New York's a city that kind of constantly rebuilds itself. So there's the kind of ground plane that we think of, the streets. Obviously, there's the ground plane, the public realm of the subway. But here there's also the kind of 19th century ground plane that's defined by the greenhouse, the sort of this kind of plane of masonry structures that were sort of a function of the technology of building. So those in turn, once the advent of the elevator and steel frame construction came along, that kind of ground plane was supplanted by taller structures. So here you can start to see the kind of existing campus center that we are demolishing and replacing. But sadly, what this little project did is it actually bifurcated the campus with this rather imposing set of steps and this 17-foot high wall so that you could never make a connection across the ground plane as originally had been anticipated. The project also programmatically recognizes that unlike early campus life at Barnard and other institutions, including here, campus life increasingly mirrors a sort of the vibrancy of the city. And in a certain way, we were very intrigued with taking the very sort of simple program pieces, Java City being the cafe, for example, the event space, Black Box Theater, and mapping those over the course of a day to kind of talk about the sort of ways in which juxtapositions might in fact be encouraged and intensified. The kind of program suggested a simple box. We were intrigued by slicing that box to visually connect the two sides of campus, which you see defined by that kind of this sort of line here, and then starting to think about ways in which we could remove parts of the building to allow students, faculty, and visitors to see and be seen. Again, in a way that sort of, I think we were testing out in the earlier project at Smith College. An early sketch that talks about movement. If Smith was essentially 3 levels, this, because of its height, becomes a much more diagonal movement up 5 levels above grade and 2 below. But we were also interested in establishing a series of sight lines through the building so that there'd be a sort of internal coherency to the various spaces. And then finally, if the kind of paradigm of sort of colleges was to sort of turn away from the city, this was an opportunity to rethink that and to sort of make a kind of window onto the city on Broadway that would talk about Barnard's activities rather than sort of sheltering them behind the kind of symbolic wrought iron fence. Like many multi-use buildings, it's extremely dense, and we are sort of in the process of kind of exploring how this meandering route, which is sort of identified by the little red line, starts to break down the kind of orthogonal quality of the floor plates. You can start to see how there's a sort of attempt to give measure to this idea of cascading slipped atria. The wall on the left here is a kind of fritted glass that, depending on your orientation, is either transparent or opaque. You can sort of see it has a sort of slightly diaphanous quality from this particular view. And it sort of marks areas of public circulation. This is a view from the crit spaces. There are architecture studios, art studios. The architecture studios are kind of loft-like spaces, not unlike the ones you have here. And they look down, we're looking down on a kind of media library, down to a dining room, and then finally to a cafe. And that cafe spills out onto Lehman Lawn so that we can kind of return to the idea of claiming Lehman Lawn as a sort of programmatic hotspot. This is an area that is characterized, if any of you have been to Columbia, it's primarily a brick campus. Columbia's sort of great buildings were done by McKinley and White. They're really quite extraordinary. So the challenge for us was how to take that legacy and maybe rethink it, how to sort of bring it into, give it a different voice. And we began by exploring a kind of panelized system of composite glass panels that would start to sort of employ a gradient of change as they moved around the 4 sides of the building, and would register not only the kind of internal tensions, the sort of programmatic tensions, but also the urban condition or the campus condition. These, in turn, and you kind of see this slightly simplified mapping exercise, attempt to take what is a sort of conventional curtain wall system and start to juxtapose it with slightly unconventional materials so that there's a certain depth to it and a certain way of marking and making vivid the section of the building.
Now, this idea of gradient of change was something that by the time we were sharing our ideas of these panels, and I'll talk about them in a moment, we discovered that everybody's version of what terracotta or brick color is wildly different. What we were very keen on doing was translating the chroma of the brick and terracotta campus into something that was a contemporary material. And working with glass manufacturers in Germany, what we were able to work with was the idea of an externally acid-etched color integral panel. What's wonderful about the external acid etching, which has never been done in this country, is it makes the building just as soft as the brick buildings in appearance and takes away the kind of the terror that the client had of the commercial glass buildings that they thought it might be. But you could also see that it has a kind of diaphanous quality. Now, the other thing that Michael mentioned is that this building is dense packed, and while we were seeking for ways to get relief and openness through stairs and slipped atria to create this sense of communication, since tall buildings tend to segregate themselves socially, we also had the issue of diverse uses. Studios that wanted lots of light versus offices that might want less. So we came up with 5 different scale panel systems and determined a way to actually move these around the building in such a way that transparent vision lights versus the translucent lights, which in fact are actually shadow box and thermally insulated spaces, could operate with some kind of efficiency. But what you start to see here is a gradient of programmatic scale, super large windows that you can see right here in the double height spaces that slip all the way through. And if you look closely, you'll see that that translucent acid etched color slips over to the vision panels, so that arguably, according to our client, she wondered if she needed to put her glasses on and was losing her vision. But the idea is to really get the sense of that chroma to slip over. Now, this idea of this kind of wandering experience within an arts building, we think it's all the loose fit spaces where everything really happens, where the conversations occur, where people actually will probably end up using this staircase for pinup space, but we won't tell the fire marshal. It's worth noting right here, by the way, that the place of honor here is the senior studio, which is 12 students who are undergrad who get to have that space. And the rest of this kind of staircase was taking the idea that, say, in the Midwest, where you have all these sweeping diagonals on the green to walk across, we simply tip that kind of sort of traverse up vertically on this building because, indeed, this is a vertical building. But you can also see that this kind of route is something that links up finally to these descending amphitheater steps that link that Millbank Courtyard Garden to Lehman Lawn. So we were as preoccupied with connecting a disconnected campus as we were with creating this new Center for the Arts. And so there it is. That's the wall that Michael described, the 17-foot grade change, and this, the award-winning 1964 Campus Center, which has just been demolished as of about 2 weeks ago. We're in construction right now. But what we really wanted to do was actually change this barrier into something that could actually be a part of the kind of landscape legacy then of the historic Millbank up to the contemporary lawn. And so you can see that arguably at dusk students could gather and sit there and see, more importantly, the diagonal wedge shape of the building, make sure that you can see the main gate of the campus from the historic core and center. And there it is as it had stood before. Arguably defending itself to the ravages of the city in 1964, to something that we think welcomes the city in and says that it is, in fact, a transparent 24-hour building. And I understand that since architecture is here, you all have set the trend that this building is the one building downtown that is lit up 24 hours. Now, this last project is one that you had obviously probably a preview of as you walked in here this evening, but this in many ways has been a seminal project for Michael and myself in that it brought together all of our preoccupations of thinking about art, urban life, infrastructure, landscape, architecture as being, in a sense, reciprocal rather than each other or separate. The Olympic Sculpture Park for the Seattle Art Museum was shaped in part by Mark Robbins, who, as director of NEA's design program, was part of the group that said this should be a competition, an international search and a limited competition, as opposed to just, say, interviews. Seattle Art Museum knew they had an amazing site, but knew they had some challenges. If you can see right here, this is an arterial high-bodied, wide-bodied trucking route that needed a 20-foot clearance. This is Amtrak and Burlington Northern Railways here, and they needed everything, 23-foot 6 clearance. This is a brownfield site. It used to be the site of Union Oil of California. It was holding tanks, and so it's entirely contaminated. And this was the trolley barn that almost made it impossible to take this site as part of the property. These two are museum-owned, this is city-owned. Over here is Merle Edwards Park. It's one of the few waterfront parks the city has, but you have to drive to the parking lot to get to it. Now, this is a site that's had an amazing history. In fact, where that high-bodied, wide-bodied trucking route was used to be the edge of the water until the Denny regrade happened. This was pre-politically correct development. They simply hosed down the bluffs to create new flat landscape. And in thinking of eminent domain as a kind of cruel sport, these were the people who didn't sell out soon enough, and these are the remains of their property until they sold. Now that was actually that was a 30-year period from the late 1800s to about 1928. Now what that did was it did create real estate. The water's edge was right here. It brought that water's edge all the way out. When the Seattle Art Museum decided they were going to make this into a sculpture park free and open to the public, they were as committed to bringing art to the public as they were to bringing the park and environmental life into focus. So what you can see is that they in fact had a little budget. They already gave us a budget, and they said they imagined that the park would be designed in these 3 parcels, and they thought that maybe a couple of artists like Sia Armajani might do some fantastic art bridges, and that was their starting point, but they knew that maybe they could do something a little bit different. Their other one was that they said they didn't have the budget for it, was to cover the entire site up a la Millennium Park, conceal all the infrastructure and maximize the footprint and get the most space for art that was unobstructed by the infrastructure. We actually loved the trains and we loved the trucks and we loved its life in the city and started to think about how those kind of northwest or north-south forces could actually start to shape and configure the site and still create a kind of connective tissue. And this makes it look easy. We did a lot of really bad schemes first, until we actually had a few drinks one night and we're at Odeon in New York and tore up a business card and in fact discovered that we could do it all with one small move.
That's not the way to design.
No, I actually think the drink's terribly important after you've done your homework. But what you can start to see here was an idea that something could begin at the city edge with something very built, like the pavilion, which was required, and wander from the city down to the water's edge, literally a park that wandered down from the city to the water's edge. It would become highly structured at one end to something that might actually become submergent and into the water's edge down here. And in fact, because we were lucky enough to have a 40-foot grade change, courtesy of the Denny regrade, we were able to cross at a very slow descent over the highway, over the train tracks with a more accelerated descent here. And you can start to see what we were most intrigued with is that all these views in Seattle, everybody talks about the views. I mean, there's a certain point where a view is a view is a view. We wanted to focus them so that you could get the distinctions of them. And in this direction, you can see on this leg, the view of the Olympic Mountains, which the park is named after, is extraordinary. And in the other direction, right here, the views of the city are amazing, looking down these paths. And so that became the premise of exaggerating the difference, and in a sense doing a trick that all golf course designers know, that within finite real estate, if you slalom between trees, you have the fictional sense that in fact you're on an immense landscape, but you're just going back and forth. Now, you can see this is a final built project here. When it opened in January, it was pretty fortunate that on opening day, after major storms, we had some pretty wonderful weather. But you can also see that we were lucky enough that some of the excavation for the remediation allowed us to have this valley here where the pavilion could unfold with descending grass terraces down to Richard Serra, which we'll talk about later. But this kind of topography really had to take in all the energies. This was a seminal sketch for us. We realized that architecture really is this massive compromise of trying to please everything. And once you try to please everything, usually you please no one. So the question was, what could be central enough that could deal with an infrastructural topography? And that was our premise here, is that we had to deal with fish and remediation and trolleys and water taxis and trucks and trains, and we just actually wanted to completely embrace the energy rather than conceal it. And this translated into what we described as a kind of chameleon section that began as a huge earthwork over here to get up and actually allow the garage to slip underneath there, and descend down into something very, very slender and actually acquire a kind of subsurface reality here to create the city's first aquatic habitat for salmon. Now, it really is about layers, and it was the intensification of layers. The name of this lecture, Surface, Subsurface, has been an ongoing preoccupation, which is that which you see on the surface, in our mind, actually should emerge from subsurface, either histories or conditions that have a real presence. And in this case, the remediation, we still needed to manage to steer clear of monitoring wells. We had to accommodate the city's infrastructure and movement. We wanted to collect water so that it could be, instead of dropped in the storm sewer system, actually irrigate and finally work into this code. We had to consider what it might be to have about 2.5 miles of infrastructure underneath the path so that artists could do video work, film work, waterworks at any given time, anticipating the future. And then you could see that path connecting it all. And then we worked with a local landscape architect, Charles Anderson, whose knowledge of native plants was really tremendous to be able to add another dimension to the kind of ecology of the park. So you can start to see this thing being built over time, and what was so exciting for us is there was a webcam in the office, and we were out there just about every other week during construction, but being able to see this thing being built up and grow before our eyes was tremendous. But you can start to see here, even in some of those early things, we were still using aerial photographs to help trace, because we were working with artists like Mark Dion to figure out how this trajectory of pieces could come together. And there you can see it nearly complete in this view. But what was most interesting for us is recognizing that this is indeed an earthwork. And as an earthwork, the issue of holding back that earth became a preoccupation that interested us a lot. And our civil engineers, we originally thought we were going to have poured-in-place concrete walls. After the first pricing exercise, it was clear we were not. We were shifting towards what's called MSE, or mechanically stabilized earth, which is like a very cheap version of gabion walls that are done in roughly 8-inch lifts all the way up. And then what we did was we recognized the kind of seismic dynamic nature of Seattle was going to, seismically dynamic, was going to make us, force us into a system that could be flexible. And so the overlapping concrete walls that you see allowed us to create a mark or a meter that would operate on the grade change, be shippable from concrete on flatbed concrete trucks, and among other things, go up 42 inches above the grade so that we could avoid the architectural presence of handrails that start to get competitive with the art. So you can start to see them pouring these MSE retaining walls. And then you can see the kind of cladding of that, if you will, with these concrete overlapping panels. And what we did, and you can't quite see it here, is that we did a sandblast pattern right up against the edge, so if there were any seismic activity, the kind of pre-abraded panel would conceal any kind of history of the movement. But those walls, in fact, are pretty amazing. They capture the light here. This is light that's being passed through an artwork by Teresita Fernandez that Michael will talk about. But we wanted not to make these walls straight in a smooth line, but allow them to mark their meter, among other things, to conceal any discrepancies in the perfection of construction. But there it is. That's the Elliott Avenue right there that cuts all the way through. This has got major traffic pretty much all day long. And you can start to see the bridging over, a very simple earth bridge framed by steel with concrete walls on either side. But what we loved is the fact that this could become a place where projections could occur across the way, but become this dynamic understanding of where you were truly in the middle of something that could never really be fully understood as a bridge except from below. And here you are, dead middle of the highway right here. And just to keep people from cutting across the wedge of brass right here, we put in a concrete wedge or a seat for viewing to keep the shortcut from happening. We were also preoccupied with this idea of perspectival expansion of space. There's a golf course trick, but there's also the tapering. The building itself comes down to 8 feet, opens up to 20 feet. The paths begin at 12 feet, they open up to 32 feet. Same thing over here. And by the way, over there on occasion, Mount Rainier comes out. But the sense was to be able to elongate and expand that experience. And over the train tracks here, the idea of being able to have an asymmetrical bridge thrusting with a concrete girt on one side that would land onto this pier over on this side that allowed us to shorten the length of these steel pieces to get them within budget. You never know how you get there. But this is now the overlook, and what we love is that the train spotting community apparently is every bit as active as the art-loving community. And there's the trains that are running by all the time. And this waterfront has this amazing quality of high tide or low tide. There's a 6-foot tidal fluctuation, but there's the salmon habitat on a bench that Michael will talk about over there, and this is the major ascent up to reach the grades of the park. And here it is. We actually were very excited about the fact that the whole topography collapses from the water's edge. And there you can see the kind of water feature that we talked about that brings the water that waters these plants before it spills into the beach. And these are the benches that we designed. There were 14 different foam core mock-ups built by one intern from Rice over the course of the summer. He was thrilled to death to find out that everybody loves them now in steel.
One of the things about Seattle is you learn about salmon, and we had not one salmon aquatic specialist, but two. And we learned all about juvenile salmon because part of the success of this project hinged on being able to recreate natural habitat for salmon. So one of the things that we were particularly proud of is that we were able to make this beach, typically the edges of the Seattle waterfront are all armored. It's all concrete. You can never touch the water. Now this isn't, you know, Saint-Tropez, it's cold water, but still there's something magical about that capacity. And what happens is that the juvenoid salmon can actually spawn here and rest and are a little sheltered from predators. And we found out that juvenoid salmon are a lot like their humanoid counterparts. They travel in groups. They're very particular about their habitat. And they're also extremely unpredictable about what they like to eat. So it's an amazing little sidebar there. But the idea of surface, subsurface, and rethinking of where the kind of ground plane is evident in what we did, which you can't quite see, but this is a sort of set of tidal terraces, and they're marked by beds of kelp. So the idea of the kind of landscape, the sort of material palette of landscape, we love to think of kelp as every bit as beautiful as pines or quaking aspens. And this too becomes a kind of clock. In a way, you can see a little bit of a nod to the early Smithson slide. The other thing that was quite fantastic is, unlike sculpture parks or museums where you typically start with a collection, the thing that was incredibly radical, and some people thought foolhardy on the part of the Seattle Art Museum, is they started out with only one piece of sculpture, which was the Calder in the lower right. What that allowed them to do, which was in hindsight a kind of brilliant proposition, is that it allowed them to think of engaging a series of artists to work as we were designing the park, to develop a series of completely integrated pieces of work. Conventional sculptures, of course, do have their place here too, but even the Calder, as sort of a kind of iconic presence here, you can start to see it. It wandered, as Marion showed on that one little construction sketch, over many different parts of this park, and then finally was sort of set here after the park was in place. And fantastic to kind of think of a piece like this establishing a kind of scale against this incredibly majestic backdrop. But likewise, we were told that topography was the antithesis of the conventional sculpture park, but Mike McCaffrey, the brilliant exhibition designer, sort of took this piece by Klaus Oldenburg, kind of, I don't know, many of you don't know what this is. It's an eraser, typewriter eraser, but we love the whimsy with which Klaus Oldenburg's piece looks like it's actually running away from the sculpture park, trying to get away from all these Calders. But this is one piece that was completely integrated in the process of design. We worked closely with Teresita Fernandez. The BNSF railroad is like the Vatican. They have immutable rules, and one was that they needed a throw fence to keep people from, we found out, jumping onto the tracks. So the museum talked to Teresita, who worked with us to come up with this very beautiful idea where she took the kind of armature that was going to hold a throw fence and kind of completely turned it around from a liability into an asset with these highly, digitized, almost garish images of what people think of as landscape and sunsets. So it plays very beautifully with the idea of nature and culture. Even more extreme is Mark Dion's piece. Mark is an environmental artist, and what he proposed, much to the shock of a number of conservative trustees, he said, I'm going to propose an 80-foot long rotting log. And somehow he convinced them that this was the thing to do. We're told that this piece will last about 100 years. But we worked with Mark to develop this incredible kind of cocoon or sarcophagus for it. And here you see it. Actually, the green is totally functional. It mimics the quality of light that you would get on an ancient forest floor. So this fantastic tongue-in-cheek piece of nature brought to the city is also a way in which children can learn about life, death, decay, and incredible lessons that otherwise might just be untouched. But what whimsy. A classic piece by Richard Serra. This is his piece, Wake. We worked with Richard to cite this piece, and Richard is an incredible artist. I think it was actually an incredible learning experience. He, as Richard Serra would do, had a series of suggestions about how his piece ought to be more carefully framed, but they're really good suggestions. So the geometry here responds to his piece in ways that we wouldn't have, I think, done had we been working without the benefit of a kind of collaborative mind. We love this piece. We wish somehow these things could have been parked there permanently. Incredible. Just the choreography, these sort of giant, almost like big elephants doing a dance. Here's Richard Serra very proudly. It's like he's standing by his baby, making sure no one touches the steel, but you can sense the kind of enormous scale and the choreography that it takes to build this. And then here you see the kind of final product, the sort of juxtaposition of these large plates against the pavilion. And the thought or the hope is that the pavilion sort of somehow either cascades and becomes sort of dissolves into this particular piece, or alternately the sort of piece crystallizes itself into a series of architectural elements. Likewise, Marion mentioned the sort of all the teledata. Increasingly, art is sort of going in territories that you'd never imagine artists to be playing with, certainly not sculptors. This is Iole Alessandrini, who did this laser piece, and she took this sort of the soft grass and animated it, shot a series of laser lights across it so that it becomes almost brittle and incredibly sort of beautiful and crystalline. Likewise, inside the pavilion, I think if you sort of have the memory of this zigzag, that section works its way up into the pavilion. We don't have a photo yet. We're still doing a little bit of work up here, but this then becomes a very special place that has a view. You reconnect yourself with the whole park. But this piece here is a piece by the Mexican artist Pedro Reyes. In a way, he's playing with the idea of the great sort of tradition of Mexican muralists. But he also came up with this inventive set of pupelas, which invite kids to play and sort of crawl into these cocoons, which thankfully are braced with these really super strong steel cables, because once kids start rocking in these things, they really get going. But if we then kind of look at the sort of topography and think of it how it sort of flattens out, these are bits of sort of serendipity. In many ways, these views, like this one, we could not have designed this view. It just sort of collapses on itself rather magically. And I think there's an argument, and we won't go into it, about letting architecture go to a certain degree and letting the sort of the kind of spirit or the accident of a place sort of give measure. Likewise, the pavilion, sort of, it starts at the city. It's the most kind of architecturally present piece on the park. Very, very artificial. There was no sense or no interest on our part of the museums in turning this into a kind of log cabin. But one of the things about Seattle that's magical is the quality of light, which changes over the course of the day. And we thought then, in order to really sort of magnify this, we would play with a pleated steel paneling system and a fritted glass system. So you can start to see how the paneling becomes sometimes almost black. This is stainless steel, brushed stainless steel. Or it sort of picks up this kind of soft, overcast light At night, you can imagine cars whizzing by, becomes kind of flickering. And likewise, the sort of mirrored glass, these are very thin bands of mirror. They in turn mirror the headlights, which you can kind of see a little bit as the cars come by, so that in many ways a kind of syncopation, the surprise of urban life becomes part of the kind of artifice of the architecture. Again, the sort of scalar relationships that in many ways surprised us in how they collapse. And then finally, I think what was most important for us is the proposition that as designers, as architects in this case, we and all our collaborators were able to kind of reinvent a kind of setting and turn what was otherwise a sort of derelict piece of land into a kind of public place. So in closing, we would hope that the ideal and the circumstantial are collapsed within the surface and subsurface of these projects. And we hope this belief registers architecture's capacity to critique and transform reality. Thank you. Shouldn't be a shy group.
First of all, I just want to say that the work is really nice. I'm really interested in.
Thank you.
Really interested in this Smith College diagram showing the urban flow. I think it was one of the first images that you showed, and it seems to me that the kind of design for the building came out of that, how the urban flow to cut through the residential area to the main part was pretty important in the design process. And I'm wondering how that how you kind of hold on to an idea in the diagram process, and how you keep that and try to work with that, and if so, if it changes, how do you deal with that?
Take a first stab at it.
Well, I think Michael and I probably have two really different answers to that. We usually have incredibly different approaches and find ourselves, fortunately, liking where we end up. But for us, I think designing from the inside out and from the diagrammatic genesis allows you to feel like you have an anchor to return to. We postponed conclusions about the outside of the building for a very long time. You saw all those, what we called the animals, those models. We didn't have a clue what the outside was going to look like, actually, for a really long time. But if you dive in the middle of the pool and get to know what you want to know the most, other things start to fall into place. So I'd say start in the middle and then find the edges.
We actually tend to agree, but I think, yeah, sorry. But I think you probably saw consistently different ways of diagramming a project and drawing it differently, looking at it differently, modeling it both physically and digitally differently. And I think there is, for us, and I think for many of you in this room, the constant need to return to a kind of diagram as a way of checking how a project is going. And I think we would argue that in the context of practice, where there are many, many different kinds of agendas, conflicting agendas, the power of the diagram is even more critical. And that's what sort of galvanizes not only a client, but a team, a very large team of people who are working over a period of several years. And if that diagram isn't clear, and if you can't return to it and critique it, then I think you've lost the genesis of the project. You've lost its heart.
The Seattle project is spectacular. At the beginning of your presentation, you made a comment in passing about a trolley building, and there's a suggestion there that almost brought the project down. Sounds like there's a story behind that. Can you share that story?
There was a lot of work to convince various mayors that it was a good thing to relocate this trolley, but it wasn't anything that they all formally agreed on until, I would say, maybe about 6 months before construction. And it was a big, big deal. It was almost derailed right before that by the proposal of a viaduct tunnel that would come through our site. Why? Because the Army Corps of Engineers recognized that one of the few available unbuilt sites in the city was this park. So there were more petrifying things like that. And the trolley barn, which is just a maintenance shed, became something that was emblematic of things that were being lost on the waterfront. And it took forever to get it relocated.